Okay, so I'm going to go over kind of the basic structure of the nervous system. We'll talk about some of the parts of the brain that we will talk about as we move through this semester and as we talk about different sensory systems. So the nervous system has two parts. The central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. It's called central because it's right along the central part of our axis. And then the peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the brain and the spinal cord. It's the nerves that exit the cranium and enter the cranium from the face and neck. And it's all the nerves that exit and enter through the spinal cord and go out to all the organs of the body and your muscles and everything else. Okay? The enteric nervous system is actually your gut brain. Lining your digestive system is a plexus of nerve cells, and that are relatively independent of the brain. They interact, but the enteric system is actually able to make decisions. It's not really thinking, but it's able to act pretty much on its own. The autonomic nervous system includes the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. These two systems have control over our vegetative functions. They're generally oppositional. So the sympathetic system generally arouses us, and the parasympathetic acts to calm us down. Sympathetic involves our fight or flight response. So if you're walking in the woods, see a bear, sympathetic system gets activated, and your heart starts beating faster. Your lungs are able to take in more air. Your pupils become dilated so that you can take in more visual information. And you generally feel more alert and aroused so that you can either fight, run, or just stand there and yell at the bear. Okay? Whereas the parasympathetic does all the opposite. That slows down our heart rate, calms our breathing, constricts our pupils. Okay? We won't talk much about autonomic nervous system. Probably won't talk about it at all in the remainder of the class. But understand those processes impact perception. Right? So if I'm really relaxed, I may not be as attentive to things in the environment. Sympathetic, appropriately stimulated, I become more alert, more attentive, but over aroused due to stress, everything else, and it can be hard to take in information. I could be overwhelmed by sensory information very, very easily. We'll mostly focus on the brain and spinal cord, but as you'll see, when we get to the somatosensory system, we'll talk quite a bit about spinal nerves. And I'm not going to talk about the cranial nerves, but we will, because the majority of our sensory systems involve those nerves. So there's a picture of the central nervous system. We see the brain, which is in our skull, and then the spinal cord, which extends down into our tailbone. And these are all the vertebrae that make up our spinal cord. Okay. Here's the actual tailbone. So the spinal cord actually ends a little earlier than that. And you can also see the nerves that exit and enter through the spinal cord, and their things that they're associated with. Here's a picture of the cranial nerves. You're not going to have to memorize these, but I'll just walk through them real quickly here. So they're numbered in terms of their appearance, starting with the most anterior portion or the front portion of the brain and moving posterior. So the first thing we see is the olfactory bulb and the olfactory nerve. And the second is the optic nerve, and we'll talk quite a bit about the nerve and how fibers cross here. So that the right visual field goes to the left side of the brain and the left visual field goes to the right side. Then there's three nerves that move our eyes in different directions. Okay? Eye movement is extremely important in terms of vision, as you might expect. Okay? And so we have three nerves that actually are important for that movement. The trigeminal nerve gives us sensory information from our face and mouth and sinuses. Facial moves the muscles. And then we have several that are involved in taste. The seventh, looking for them all here. The ninth, and are all involved in taste perception. And really, the trigeminal, or the fifth one, is also involved in taste, because, or at least in flavor, because mouthfeel, the texture of food, its temperature, all those things play a big role in terms of how food tastes to us. And I mean that more broadly in terms of flavor. All right. Then the eighth nerve is our vestibular system and our auditory system. The 10th, we won't talk about that, but that's one of the longest nerves in our body, and it controls much of our gut region, hearts, lungs, GI tract, and all those sorts of things. All right. So we'll come back to a lot of these. We won't talk about the motor one so much, but we will talk about the sensory nerves. All right, so here's an overview of the brain. Okay. The brain is covered by a tough, by 3 layers of tissue called the meninges. Okay. The outer layer is very tough and leathery. It's actually very hard to cut through. Inside our brain, we have some holes. Okay. These are called ventricles. Okay. And the ventricles is where our cerebral spinal fluid is produced. And that fluid fills up those spaces within our brain, as well as the spinal canal. And that fluid surrounds our whole brain, and it's kind of held in there by the meninges. Okay? So our brain is essentially floating in fluid, right, inside our skull. It doesn't have a lot of solidity to it, and without that fluid, it would really kind of collapse on itself, and it could get banged pretty good even in that fluid, but it would be really, really vulnerable to damage without that. The lower part of the brain, okay, which melds into the spinal cord here, is the brainstem. The brainstem is made up of the medulla, which is right here at the bottom, the pons, the midbrain, which is right up here, and the cerebellum. Okay? So these make up what's called the brainstem. The brainstem has a number of different functions, but one of the most important is that it has life-sustaining functions. So if you have damage, particularly in the area of the medulla, you're very vulnerable to dying, because there's areas there that are important for keeping your heart beating, for breathing, and many other life-sustaining functions as well. Okay? The cerebellum we'll talk about when we get to the vestibular sense, which is important for balance, and when we get to proprioception, which is also important for balance. Okay? 80% of all the cells in the brain are right here in the cerebellum, and as you can see, it's relatively small compared to our forebrain, which includes the cerebral cortex. Okay? There's 128 billion neurons in the brain, and 80% of them are right here in the cerebellum. This white band of tissues, find my cursor, my white band of tissues right here, it's called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is a band of fibers that connect our right and left hemispheres. Okay. And as you can see, they're relatively white in this picture. Okay. And that's, if we were to look at a fresh brain, it would look white compared to the rest of the brain. The rest of the brain, at least from the view that we have, would be kind of gray in color. Okay. White matter refers to all the connections between neurons. So corpus callosum is a major pathway for those connections, whereas gray matter refers to the cell bodies themselves within the nervous system. So we're not going to talk a lot in terms of sensory systems. We won't talk a lot about the medulla and the pons, so know that it's important in terms of life-sustaining functions. The midbrain, on the roof of the midbrain, it's called the tectum, T-E-C-T-U-M, tectum. The tectum contains 4 bumps, okay? And you can kind of see them here. Right. Those bumps form the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. Okay. We are going to talk a lot about the superior colliculus when we talk about vision, because it's very important for eye movements. Okay. We'll mention the inferior colliculus when we get to audition, because it's important for locating sounds. Okay. So both of these, superior colliculus and inferior colliculus, what they're really important for is helping us to orient towards stimuli. Okay. In reptiles and birds, the tectum, the roof of the midbrain, actually serves as their visual cortex. Okay. In mammals, it still has that role in vision, but it's the very back of the cortex. That is where our visual cortex is. Okay, so brainstem, midbrain with the superior colliculus, inferior colliculus. Okay. Right back here is the pineal gland. That plays an important role in sleep. And right here, this round area, is the thalamus. Okay. The thalamus is it's essentially, for our purposes, it's more complicated than this, but for our purposes, the thalamus is a relay station between our sensory systems and the cerebral cortex. Okay? So, for example, here's your eye, here's the optic nerve, and as the optic nerve comes back, the first place it goes is to a part of the thalamus known as the dorsolateral nucleus. And we'll talk more about that. The lateral geniculate nucleus. Okay? We'll talk more about that when we get to vision itself. But so from the retina, the optic nerve travels to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus and then to the back of the brain. All right? So comes thalamus, then up here. And every sensory system on its way to the cortex comes through the thalamus before it goes there. Every sensory system except olfaction. Olfaction is the exception. So there's the thalamus. Below that is the hypothalamus, which we're not going to talk about in this class at all. But the hypothalamus is the master gland of your endocrine system. It controls the hormones that are released from the pituitary gland. And it plays important roles in sleep and eating and feeding, drinking, mating, stress, So it plays a lot of role in a lot of different vegetative, life-sustaining functions. And, okay, so the thalamus and the hypothalamus are part of the forebrain that's called the diencephalon. Right? That's D-I-E-N, di-N, and then C-E-P-H-A-L-O-N. Okay? The diencephalon. Then the rest of the forebrain is made up of the cerebral cortex, and then underneath the cerebral cortex are a number of structures. Okay? The only one that we may talk about in terms of those structures is the hippocampus. And you can't really see the hippocampus in here, but the hippocampus is found in this region. If you could just peel back the cortex a little bit. Hippocampus is very important for memory, but it's where a lot of different sensory systems all come together. The hippocampal cells respond to multiple types of sensory information. And one of the things that's really important for is context. Okay? So if I saw a lion in the wild, okay, in that context, I'm going to be scared. But if I see a lion at a zoo and he's safely behind some enclosure, right, then I'm not going to be scared. So that's where how context plays a big role in perception. Right. This outer area with all these bumps and grooves is the cerebral cortex. The bumps are called gyri, and the grooves are called sulci. There's two prominent sulci that serve as landmarks. One is the lateral sulcus, or lateral fissure, and the other is the central fissure. Right behind the central fissure is the somatosensory cortex. Right in front of the central fissure is our motor cortex. Along the lateral sulcus towards the back is our auditory cortex. All right, we'll talk more about all that in a minute. So the main things I want you to know from this is brainstem, and that it's important for life-sustaining functions. Cerebellum is important for balance, and the superior and inferior colliculus are important for orienting towards different stimuli, and the superior colliculus is important for eye movements. Okay? I want you to know that the thalamus is important for relaying information from lower areas of sensory systems up to the cortex, and know that the hippocampus is important for understanding context, in which we're encountering stimulus, and that cerebral cortex, the bumps are called gyri, and the grooves are called sulci. Let me show you an actual picture. All right. You can see the ventricles. You can see those little spaces within the brain. That white band is the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres. Okay? And you can get some sense of the fluid that is surrounding the brain in here. This outer part would be the meninges, okay, which is showing up, and then you have your skull. Here's the brainstem. The lower part's the medulla, and you can see how it just transitioned into the spinal cord. This round area, and then right above it is the pons. And here's the cerebellum. And then here's the midbrain, and there's the superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, thalamus, and again the cerebral cortex. All right. In the next video, I'll talk about the organization of the cortex.